The guest speaker is
Lieutenant General Louis B. Hershey, Director of the Selective Service System. The panelists are Donald J. Irwin, Democratic Congressman from the state of Connecticut, and John Mayer, Regional Director of Research, Students for a Democratic Society. The moderator is Professor Philip E. Arida of the Harvard Law School. Here to introduce the program is Professor Arida.
My job tonight is simply to introduce the other speakers, and in the case of necessity, to throw a cloud of dialectical confusion over any obstreperous question. In the law school manner. General Hershey we'll talk about the draft. Although he has indicated that he wanted to be a lawyer, and has indeed practiced, as he puts it, as a guardhouse lawyer. He will, I suppose, during the question period, tell you each individually your exact status and when you can expect the call. I don't know just how extensive General Hershey's initial remarks are going to be. He will answer questions later to whatever he does not cover at the outset. Some questions that perhaps I might pose, which would be of interest here, recurrent questions, are first, we might want to consider, General Hershey might want to consider whether conscription is really necessary. It's expensive, in many respects it's inequitable, and it's often said to be less efficient than a professional army. General Hershey has these points in mind. We discussed them a bit at dinner, and he might want to talk about that. He might want to talk about the inequities, the troublesome inequities that are inherent in any system of conscription. He might want to talk about the question of excessive discretion in the hands of local boards. In particular, questions of interest to you might be the current status of the 26-year-old dividing line, the 2S deferment, the status of married men, and the like. A question of particular interest on which General Hershey has made some comments in the past, and which perhaps he will want to talk about tonight, is the use of the draft as a means of educating and rehabilitating unadjusted youth in our society. The question of physical and mental standards for the draft. Whether he chooses to talk about conscientious objection policy, we shall have to wait and see. In particular, whether we should move toward a more universal form of military service, again, a question that General Hershey might want to consider. General Hershey indeed is known to all of us. He was chasing people when I was in law school, and he still is. He has said that he has continued running the draft because no one else wanted the job. But I have a sense after our discussion during dinner that General Hershey has a unique set of abilities, a perception about the problems of conscription in our society, and a peculiar sense of how to get things done in the complicated government that we have. There's no need for me to add to the data that appears in the program, which you all have, on General Hershey's background. It's enough to say that it's a great pleasure to introduce General Hershey.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Mr. Moderator, President of the Association, my colleagues, ladies, possible candidates for office in this august body, and the members of this august body, wheresoever you may be. I come here with a great deal of humility. I'm from far enough from here that your fame rings clear. Out in Indiana, we only see the halo on the sky, and we're not close enough to notice the things that other schools that I shall not mention that are represented here tonight may be able to see in the lack of detail in the way that you operate. In the first place, I am always flattered to have an opportunity to get, I don't suppose it's right to say, a bit of immortality by being able to talk to the people that are going to be running this country, or ought to be, if they accept their responsibilities for which they've been trained in 15 or 20 years from now. And that's quite an upbuilding thing to think that you gone can still have had a chance to talk. And if you people are not running the country pretty largely 20 years from now, somebody made a mistake in letting you in the first place, and somebody made a mistake sending you in the second place. But I have a very, very high regard for you, and as I say, out in Indiana, we only hear the marvelous things of Harvard, and I know there are other things, but we don't hear them out there. So I do want to do a bit of a commercial, and I'm a little bit handicapped. Normally, if I come to some of the states or commonwealths, I can say that this state and commonwealth is the best run commonwealth that I have been in today. But I have on the panel here a man from one of our neighboring states that was the best run one that I'd been in 3 weeks ago. And not only that, about everybody I've talked to tonight of these brilliant students that I've had a chance to meet came from far away, even farther. They came farther than I have. They had to go farther away from home to get into school than I did when I went to school. So therefore, I've just about got to compliment the whole United States. Now, I'm not going any farther than that. I know you've got some people that didn't come from any of them, but I haven't any responsibilities over there. And so I'm just going to say this is, I owe a great obligation to every state, but just today I'm working Massachusetts. And Massachusetts happened to have been the state that furnished the largest percentage of its men of the large states, and I'm talking about large, there was only one other, and that only had 100,000 people in it, and they had about 57% of the people that went. Now, I'm not trying to advise you to appeal your cases to other states, although if you're acute as I think you're going to be as lawyers, you might sense that maybe this is not the place where you ought to have your tribunal, but perhaps they've changed too, and remember we took 16.5 million in World War II, and we aren't anywhere near that now. We'll have to multiply by 8 or 7 at least to get up there. So it's great to be here, and it's great to have a lot of young people around. And if I would sit down, it would be a good thing, but we don't do that sort of thing. You know, we're having a good time, and somebody raps on something, said we have a man here with a message. Now, I agreed to come here in April. And at that time, the future of the draft was a little different than it is now. We were just coming out of the situation where our death had been announced, but the funeral had not been set. Now, you know, a year ago, there was quite a little abolishing going on. It was supposed to be good for votes, and I never felt that it was, but that's neither here nor there. I never got elected to anything either, except second lieutenant. I enlisted as a private because it was the only place that had any vacancies at that time, and I got elected as second lieutenant, which of course is a thing to be ashamed of, and I have to rationalize by saying there's a lot of birds that never would have made it if they'd had to be elected, and I let it go at that. So therefore, I want to outline very briefly your monitor here. I thought maybe I was being examined for the bar when he started out telling what I was going to talk about. It wasn't a question of time, it was a question of my knowledge. So therefore, in the first place, whether it's right, wrong, or indifferent, the United States had some form of conscription before it had a nation. There were 606 laws in the colonies that had some form of compulsion. Now, mind you, it was run by the colonies. We got through the Revolutionary War more or less by the help of other people and one thing and another, by having some compulsion by the colonies and some bribery and that sort of thing by the federal government, as far as we had one, to try to bait people in by giving them land that was underwater or water that was under land or something. In fact, the country I came from was settled quite largely by people who had grants for folks that won the Revolutionary War. But we finally got onto the 1812 war, and we almost had secession in the New England states and the Hartford Convention. One of the reasons it was called was to protest against the possible conscription act that came awfully close to passing when it seemed we couldn't win the 1812 war any other way, and so finally we didn't have the war, or we didn't have the conscription, and we didn't win it either, so that's that. Then in the Mexican War, we didn't need it as a very small war. In the Civil War, and I'm far enough north, I guess you could call it a rebellion if I want to, but down south it has to be the war between the states. And in that, both sides tried nationally to run a conscription, and it didn't work. It was a flop on both sides, and of course it's kind of funny for the people to get out of the general government because they wanted liberty for the states, and then immediately the Confederacy started a Confederacy conscription before they even did in the North. In the North, it took more people to get them in than they got. And so, therefore, that was not an outstanding success. We went to the Spanish-American War and got back too quick to have a law, and so it was left for 1917 when the act, practically as we have it now, was passed as the first time that the federal government, short of the time we were in rebellion, had an act. And I think it's pretty well true to say that we've never had a conscription act or a selective service act or a draft act. Take your choices, because you get about as long on either one of them, about 2 years. And in each case, the Congress has never passed an act until they could not, by recruiting, get the number of people they had to have to defend the country and ensure its survival any other way. And I don't believe we have left that yet, and I don't believe we're going to. Now, so much for the history, so much for the reason. What do? We count them, sort them, and send them. Counting is called registration. You just can't go up on the hill and without a big word. And so we register them, we classify them, and we send them up, hopefully, after we've determined their acceptability, to find out whether their availability. We send them up to find out whether the armed forces will take them or not. And 50% of the time they will not. They're so good they prefer to leave them behind and let somebody else try to use them. Leadership and management has not reached the place where they can do much with some of our people as yet. However, we're looking forward. At the present time, we have somewhat over 3 million in 4F, which means that somebody thought we never could use them, and 2 million in 1Y said not yet. Later, perhaps. So, here we are. The calls are up a little bit. You'd think sometimes by some of the things we read that we never had such calls. We had 450,000 that we produced some months during the World War II and allowed 250,000 that we'd ordered to enlist, which meant about 700,000 moved, and there's quite a lot of moving around at that time, in which we had a part because your neighbors, having found that you're just the man for the armed forces, we have decided to confer upon you the privilege of get going. And so it goes. Now, at the present time, we are going into a little larger numbers, after coming through a situation where we deferred practically everybody. If they had a reason, we preferred, but if they didn't have, we made them hunt one. Now, we're going to have to not be quite as easy, and I have hoped that we will not, of necessity, be driven back to examinations and standing in class. The examinations are difficult on people who are liberal arts, as I was, because they're aimed a little bit towards the mathematics and the scientific end, and they're pretty rough on the faculty because they had to figure out who was in the upper half, and that taxes the mind, the mathematical minds of some people who are poets and that sort of thing, because they just never had gotten into mathematics to the place of dividing something into two parts. And then when you have to take 2/3 of the juniors, that made it much more difficult, and 3/4 swamped them. So therefore, we are trying very hard to get the cooperation of the educational institutions to try to divide those who came to learn from those who came. And whether we'll do it or not, I don't know. But that's what we're at. I shall summarize with about where we've got to look for people. There's 150,000 youngsters become 19 every month. No wonder the roads are full of cars. Well, speaking of cars, the cars have killed more people every month than the Indians ever did, and all the time they worked at it. But that has nothing to do with the fact that these 150,000, we get into millions and billions, and I get a little confused when I get above 10. So therefore, we have this problem of how many of these 19-year-olds are in school. Really? How many of them are students? Well, that's a different question, of course. And it's a problem to decide it. Of those who are not in school, 19-year-olds, some of them may be playing football yet in high school, who knows? And then you've got the problem of how many of the people that are not in school can pass into the armed forces. How many know enough to get in the Army if they didn't know enough to get in school? And that's a pretty tough question, and I can't answer it because we haven't had as much experience with 19-year-olds as we had with 22s or 23-year-olds. And we hope they're better. Hope. A small age. Now, so much for the 19-year-olds. We had 554,000 individuals who were husbands 3 months ago. We got 300,000 now, and we haven't inducted any of them. I suppose they've become fathers. And I look for quite a lot of activity in that area from now on. We will get some of them, and we will favor them by letting them get in December, January, and February. I don't know whether there's any left after that. We've got some one wives, 2 million of them. They're the ones that they said we would take them if we had to have them, but we don't have to have them. Now the question is, do we have to have them? And then that's the armed forces business, but the armed forces has done one thing. They have so graciously said that if you graduated from high school and can make 15 on the AFQ and T, they'll take you now instead of making you take 31. How many of them are between AFQ T15 and AFQ 31 that are high school graduates? I don't know. Should be a great many thousand, because we've got well over 100 or 200,000 of high school graduates who couldn't pass the examination into the armed forces mentally. Now, you wonder what's the matter with the high school, you wonder what's the matter with the kids, you wonder what's the matter with the armed forces. I don't know. Something wrong with all of them, probably. But just the same, that is the question. And so we've got fathers, which I don't believe we're going to work at very soon. Personally, I think that scientific people that are out trying to get away, to get people off on Earth that they don't want here and off into the beyond. Of course, there's two ways to get them into beyond, but one way is to send them out with a few billion-dollar appropriation, you know. And therefore, this is the day of the scientist. All he has to do is talk profound, no matter how stupid it may be. As long as he sounds profound, we give him credit. And so therefore, I'm expecting we're going to have, the public is going to demand that our scientific people get quite a lot of consideration. And that's neither here nor there, although if the more we'd take of somewhere else, the less we'd have to take of some other places. And I think probably you could follow that even. And so here we are today. I don't believe the calls are going up much. I don't know anything about it. You know, you read the papers. I don't. I don't know how much we're going to escalate. I don't know what escalate means, but I think it must be of some consequence because people use it, and it's a nice-sounding word. I don't know how much we're going to escalate over where we are now escalating. And therefore, I can't forecast. In our business, we have to be ready for anything that's possible and hope for many things that are only probable. And now I think I will say, so far as I'm concerned now, and you'll hear no more out of me. If you hear any more out of me, it's going to be somebody else's fault. Because like the girl said when the boy said, "May I have the last dance?" she said, "You've had it."
I neglected to clear with the general my list of questions. But but perhaps some of them will, those that interest you, will come up during the question period. Congressman Irwin is our next speaker. He has the astounding fortune to represent Republican-oriented Fairfield County. He's a Democrat. Republican-oriented Fairfield County in Connecticut, and he's done it not only once but twice. He was first elected in 1958 and was re-elected in 1964, notwithstanding an underprivileged childhood in which he did both his undergraduate and legal work at Yale. I asked Congressman Irwin what he was going to talk about, and he invoked his congressional privilege and said he wouldn't say, but perhaps now he will. Congressman Irwin.
Thank you, Professor Rita, General Hershey, John Mayer, and ladies and gentlemen. After the General's virtuous performance, I'm not sure that I'm going to break my word to you of a few minutes ago, General, when I said I was going to be very brief. I think I'll keep my word because I think I'm best off that way. I don't know exactly why I was invited here, because I'm not the most well-informed man on the subject we're discussing tonight. I frankly expect to learn a lot by being here, but I think perhaps I was chosen because I wasn't from the state of Massachusetts, and the expense of getting me here wouldn't be too large. I also came because I have 15 constituent cases I want to talk to the General about. There are 3 people that I have who want to get into the service, General, and can't do it. And there are 12 that have decided they want to pursue studies a little further. I think we're going to get into some very good business when we get into the questions, and so I'm not going to speak for a long time. I would like to say that it's my impression that, for example, over the last 10 years, the question of ending the draft has come up twice in presidential campaigns, perhaps more often, but I remember it came up, I believe it was in the 56 campaign when Stevenson was running. And at that time, the argument was that we were going to need a very highly trained, sophisticated army, and we really didn't need to draft people. And in 1964, that other great loser, Goldwater, came up with the same suggestion. I don't recall that he ever elaborated it, but he did say the same thing. I agree with the General that we're going to need it. We're going to continue to need it. We've always needed it when we've had it in the past. I do believe that we could have a better law, but I'm not sure I can tell you what it should be right now. Perhaps in the questions we'll hear some suggestions. I think with this I'll stop and let the next speaker have his word. Thank you.
Now that is a virtuous congressman. Our final panelist is John Mayer, who is a student of economics, the humanities, political science, and foreign affairs. He studied at Harvard, at the Institute of Political Studies in Paris, at the Graduate School of Public Administration, again at Harvard, and is now a research associate at MIT, where he teaches in the several fields that I mentioned. He is also active in Students for a Democratic Society. I don't know whether Mr. Mayer is going to talk about the draft as such or relate the draft to the larger situation in which we find ourselves today. Mr. Mayer.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. General Hershey, Congressman Irwin, ladies and gentlemen. I suppose the reason why I'm on the panel is because to a certain extent I'm a student. Also because to a certain extent I represent the student movement, although in fact I represent only myself. And the student movement, as we all know, has been active in opposing the war in Vietnam. Now, my impression that most of us, our attitudes towards the draft, for example, are conditioned by the war, this particular war, not by our attitudes towards military service in general, or even our attitudes towards warfare in general, but our attitudes towards this particular war, or the kinds of wars that we see coming out of this particular war. So to introduce my remarks, I'd like to talk for a few minutes about this war, or at least about how we see this war. Now, I guess those of you who have been following it all, the protests, are aware of the fact that there are a number of people in the student movement who consider the war in Vietnam immoral. That's a big word. Let's try to see a little bit more specifically what we have in mind when we say we think the war in Vietnam is immoral. For one thing, it's pretty clear that we at least feel the war is immoral because the means are immoral. To give you some idea of what I'm referring to, let me just cite a few very quick instances. In this case, I'm referring to an article by Bernard Fall, a historian of Vietnam, an article in the New Republic of October 9th. He was in Vietnam, recently returned, and he describes some of the things he saw. First, he talks about the policy of bombing whole areas of the country, which are believed to be in the hands or sympathetic to the National Liberation Front. I'll just read it short. In this particular passage, he's referring to the use of B-52 bombers. With an average bomb load of 500 tons per 30-plane raid and a known bomb dispersion pattern of about 2,000 yards by 1,000 yards for such a raid, the effects of such a bombardment on a heavily populated area can be readily guessed. Those are a lot of figures, but a B-52 is a big airplane, and we can all guess. Another passage about another problem which is brought up, which is in a sense similar in kind, somewhat different. The innocent bystanders, the people who are in fact in the battle zone, not just in areas that are sympathetic to the National Liberation Front. There are hundreds of perfectly well-substantiated stories to the effect that this merciless bombing hurt thousands of innocent bystanders, and that one of the reasons why few weapons are found in many cases is that the heaps of dead in the battle zone include many local villagers who didn't get away in time. These are some of the things that we think about. Another thing we think about is the effect of the war, the brutality of the war, and the brutalization on the people that participate in it. By this we mean Americans and Vietnamese. I'm sure all of you have seen the torture photographs of Viet Cong prisoners being tortured by Vietnamese soldiers. At the time when these photographs were current, of course, there were very few Americans there. And we might talk about this later, but at least the argument could be made, well, what can we do? We're simply advisors. They're doing this. Well, this has changed inevitably. Another quote from Fall perhaps will indicate to you the fact that, as we all should know and should be able to guess, that American soldiers are just human beings too. On September 11, 1965, the Saigon Daily News, a newspaper published entirely for the English-speaking Western community of Vietnam, showed on its front page a large photograph of American servicemen standing with drawn weapons over a heap of what the caption described as, quote, dead VC, all lying face down on the ground, and with their hands tied behind their back. There have been a number of other instances of this kind reported lately. But to raise this question is not really to condemn these people, but to try to understand the structure of the situation that leads to this kind of behavior on both sides. Congressman Irwin, in a statement made this summer, I think, shed some interesting light on the war. And I'd just like to quote for a second this. Talking about the war in Vietnam. It's a war where the innocent farmer of day by day becomes the ruthless terrorist by night, where the enemy is seldom seen, yet sniper fire, mines, and booby traps give evidence that he is everywhere. Well, how is that so? I guess that's the question I'd like to raise now. How is it that if the enemy isn't everywhere, At least he seems everywhere. Because really, if you think of the human problem involved with soldiers, American soldiers, they do look to a great extent alike. And I suspect they're universally hostile. Not universally, but very close to that. Let's go back to 1954. At that time, according to the French military sources, 60 to 90% of what is now South Vietnam was controlled by the Viet Minh, the communist insurrection against the French. At the time of the end of the war, the first end of the war, President Eisenhower felt, and so stated in his memoirs, that had elections been held, elections which were later called for by the Geneva Agreements, 80% of the population would have voted for Ho Chi Minh. That's a factor to consider. That's a factor to consider. There were a number of other observers who commented not only on the popularity of the Viet Minh, but on the fact that they seemed to be giving the people some of the basic essentials that they wanted. In this context, however, the American government decided to attempt to erect an anti-communist bastion in Southeast Asia, in South Vietnam. And it's interesting to look at the attitude at the very beginning of people involved in making the decisions. I'll quote from a letter from President Eisenhower to Prime Minister Winston Churchill, which is printed in a document which the State Department put out recently. The preliminary lines of our thinking were sketched out by Foster Dulles in his speech last Monday night when he said that under conditions of today, the imposition on Southeast Asia of the political system of Communist Russia and its Chinese Communist ally, by whatever means, would be a grave threat to the whole free community. And in our view, this possibility should now be met by united action and not passively accepted. I would underline by whatever means, because this tells a great deal of the story. In 1955 and 1956, as I guess most of you know, the Diem government, with American support, refused to allow the elections provided for in the Geneva Accords, internationally supervised elections, to be held. Now let's look for a very brief moment at what this attempt to erect an anti-communist bastion in South Vietnam entailed for the people of South Vietnam. Let's talk first about a couple of programs that Americans in power often refer to with pride. For example, the land reform program. On the face of it, it involved for people in South Vietnam a reduction of rents for peasants to a level of about 25%. And we won't haggle while it was enforced. But the important thing is that in areas where the National Liberation Front, the Viet Minh, at this time had held sway, the peasants hadn't been paying any rent at all. Now that seems like a strange policy for someone to enact who's trying to win over a population. But let's look more carefully, because I don't think it was a mistake, a question of simple error. We came into a situation where we had very little popular support. And it was necessary to find at least some indigenous group which would be sympathetic to our policies. There were essentially three sympathetic groups that were found. Bureaucrats and army officers who had been associated with the French rule, Catholic refugees from the north, and landlords. So from the very beginning, our goals shaped and even perverted what on the face of it were very good and beneficial policies. One could say the same thing for another program that we were very proud of, our economic aid program to Vietnam. If you look at the figures, and they're worth looking at, I won't take your time to read them. you'll see that the aid was given primarily in the form of weapons, advice to the police, secret police, and the army. The aid came in the form of American commodities, radios, refrigerators, whatever, which were sold to middle-class people in Vietnam, and the money generated was then used to pay the army. And it's pretty clear that none of this money did anything for the common man in Vietnam, nor, I think, was it intended to do so. Well, in this situation, it's pretty obvious that force had to be relied on to a great extent, entirely, one could say. And that's what we find in Vietnam. The first acts of the Diem regime were to declare martial law and suspend what constitutional guarantees had been in that country up until then, and there were some even under the French. Secondly, to destroy the religious sects who were challenged to his power. June and August 1956, Hamlet elections were suspended and henceforth chiefs were appointed by the central government. A very important thing for a society that lives around the villages. And as opposition began to grow, a number of more active policies were undertaken. First, there were the anti-communist denunciation campaigns, which were an attempt to ferret out the very large base of support which the Viet Minh had in the country. Then the Strategic Hamlet program, which came much later, a much more grandiose attempt to really try to resettle 80% of the population of the country. It failed. It sparked the war that we have now. So let's raise again, just very briefly, the question of ends and means. It seems to me that given our end, to create an anti-communist bastion in a country where the majority of people were sympathetic to some form of communism, at least communism as we saw it, that those ends were necessary. In fact, they were, I would argue, the only available. This is why we condemn the war. Not simply on the question of means alone, but ends and means. There are other issues, though, which I think are very important for us as Americans, because we have to ask ourselves, what is this war doing to our country? We have a pretty good idea of what it's doing to Vietnam. So one of the reasons we oppose the war is because we find, and we believe very strongly, that the prosecution of this war is in fact subverting and may eventually destroy our democracy here. Let me be specific about what I mean. Quote from a press conference given by the President July 28, 1965, talking about the war. This is a different kind of war. There are no marching armies or solemn declarations. Some citizens of South Vietnam, at times with understandable grievances, have joined in the attack on their own government. I'd like to think a minute about this, their own government. How their own government? There are a number of books written by Americans who were there and are sympathetic to American policies. Yet they all agree that those elections that were held in South Vietnam were held with incredible fraud, and that they in fact in no way reflected the feelings of the people of Vietnam, because the vast majority of the people were excluded from presenting their candidates. Let's look at some other things. Again, from the press conference I referred to. I have stated publicly, and many times, America's willingness to begin unconditional discussions with any government in any place at any time. 15 efforts have been made to start these discussions with the help of 40 nations throughout the world, but there has been no answer. That's not true. For example, As most of you may remember, President Johnson gave a speech April 7th at Johns Hopkins. 6 days later, the North Vietnamese answered in a memorandum, which was published throughout the world in the New York Times April 14th, which set forth what they believe the basis of discussion for ending the war. It was called essentially for a return to the Geneva Agreement. On May 18th, at the end of the cessation of bombings of North Vietnam, it is now clear, at least the preponderance of evidence makes it seem clear, that Hanoi, through a neutral government, assured the United States that accepting this basis of discussion that they had set forth April 13th was not to be considered a precondition for negotiations. And of course, today we have what's evident to everybody who's read the papers in the last 3 or 4 days. It's been confirmed by the State Department that an effort by the Hanoi government to negotiate in the fall was rejected. Some say it was two that was rejected, but the State Department has admitted at least one. Let's turn to one final quote, which is perhaps the most important. But we insist, and we shall always insist, that the people of South Vietnam shall have the right of choice, the right to shape their own destiny in free elections in the South, or throughout all Vietnam under international supervision. And they shall not have any government imposed upon them by force and terror so long as we can prevent it. This was the purpose of the 1954 agreements, which the communists have now cruelly shattered. Well, if you look at the records of the Geneva Agreements, you will see that as of February 28, 1961, the International Control Commission had registered 154 violations against South Vietnam and one against North Vietnam. And in the type of violations, of course, is a capsule summary of the war. From 1954 on, the Diem regime conducted a campaign of reprisals against members of the Viet Minh resistance in direct violation of Article 14 of the Geneva Agreements. From the beginning, American aid provided the backbone of Diem's army and secret police in direct violation of Articles 16, 17, and 18 of the Geneva Agreements. And again, it was the Diem regime which refused even to discuss the question of internationally supervised elections in the country. We collaborated in all of these policies, despite the fact that at Geneva, we had promised that we would not overthrow the agreements by force. There's a second, more broad reason, which, for questions of time, I'll only touch on why we oppose this war. Because as we see it, and I think as Secretary Rusk sees it, it's not the war in Vietnam which is important, or of fundamental importance. Vietnam is one of these unfortunate countries, like Spain was in the late 30s, which has been chosen, to the misfortune of its own people, of course, as a testing ground. Secretary Rusk's mind, it's a testing ground as to whether what is called national liberation movements, revolutions, whatever you want to call them, can succeed. I think that the real issue is that of revolutions in Latin America. Any of you who read the papers at all must be aware of the fact that there are a number of hot spots in Latin America. Some of you who have perhaps studied Latin America, it's a very good book out by a man named John Gerassi, a former correspondent for Time magazine, who deals in some detail with American policies in Latin America. You can see that for many of these countries, revolutions are their only hope for development, a decent life. The war in Vietnam, the intervention in the Congo, the intervention in the Dominican Republic, seemed to us to mean that the United States has put itself on a collision course with at least a large portion of the underdeveloped world, which means to us at least that there are going to be a series of wars like Vietnam throughout our generation, with all that that means. Now, from this very sketchy analysis, I think that probably our attitude towards the draft is fairly clear. We don't intend to collaborate with the government in prosecuting these wars. Our purpose rather is to attempt to bring the truth to the American people and help create a movement which can bring this war to an end and the wars like it. As far as our choices go, there's a great deal of talk now about draft evasion. Those who, when faced with military service, choose to remain silent, do a number of things. Feign physical or psychological disorder, homosexuality, drug addiction, or choose perhaps fatherhood, employment in a key industry, another year in graduate school. I think most of us feel a great deal of sympathy for these people because they're caught. But this isn't our way, because silence is something we don't think that Americans can afford today. Some of us intend to apply for conscientious objector status. Other of us will or have chosen jail. And others still will go into the armed forces, because we feel that what we have to say is perhaps most important to the people who are already there. Now the question is that patriotism? And I leave that to you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Do any members of our group care to respond at all before we go to questions? One question I'd like to put to General Hershey, suggested by Mr. Mayor's remarks, is whether any system of conscription can or should take account of the strong convictions of people who feel they don't want to participate in something like Vietnam. Is there or can there be some alternative?
In the first place, my responsibilities are not in the State Department. I am responsible to try to procure some men for a government that I accept because I haven't any other choice. There's no government on earth that I prefer over mine. I probably have voted for people who did not get elected more than anybody here. But when the elections was over, which was a democratic process, I found myself stuck with the other people's choices. And therefore, I don't see how you can let individual citizens decide which war they'll engage in. The congressman is much abler than I to answer this, because the Congress of the United States, if I read the law, has never allowed a citizen to decide that he can pick his wars. If he, for religious reasons, religion that he got by training and by belief, was opposed to all wars, then I think habitually and historically we have generally paid them some attention, and that is the present law. But whether we should or shouldn't, I am not here to defend. I came up here to talk about the draft, which is the thing that's set up by the law, and about all I can do as an administrator is to tell you what the law is and what it requires. And I'm not in any shape to debate whether we should have been in the Revolutionary War or any other. I personally think I had have missed World War I if we hadn't been weak. And I think we'd have missed World War II if we hadn't. However, that's personal opinion. But I must say that our law does not permit the citizens to decide what war they're going to participate in. If they have a religion, it keeps them from participating in any war, and they've done something in their behavior over the years that makes somebody else believe that's what they believe, then the law provides for them. Now, I realize that this is an avoidance, probably, rather than an answer to the question, but, that's the way we are on the panels.
Where are the microphones that the questioners are supposed to use?
Well, they're right here.
Oh, right. If the questioners would like to come forward and put themselves in position, and while that's going on, I would like to give to relate to General Hershey some advice provided by Tom Wicker a month or so ago, or I'm sorry, by Russell Baker a month or so ago in the New York Times. Russell Baker posed himself the question of what to do about draft card burners. My own suggestion, after trying to burn my coop card in protest for too much starch in my shirt, I found, by the way, you can't do it. It's made of plastic, and that may be the answer for draft cards. Russell Baker has a different suggestion. He points out, first putting it all in historical perspective, he says that people, of course, have always burned things. Churches, crosses, supermarkets. There was a time when people could burn people. But that isn't tolerated any longer. Nowadays, governments can burn people, but people without government burning authority are confined to burning effigies. People have always burned cities, of course, and a few years back, people burned books that disagreed with them. But the custom became stigmatized as Hitlerian, and nowadays nobody can do it without feeling like a Nazi. As a result, people sit around becoming increasingly depressed as congressional records and books by and about Hubert Humphrey spread inexorably through their houses. Burning libraries is something else. In the highly developed nations, people don't seem interested in library burning, but in less fortunate countries in recent months, firing up a good library has become a perfectly acceptable expression of student idealism. There is another class of petty burning to vent the burner's personal hostilities. A wife angry at her husband may, for example, make a dramatic show of burning the love letters he wrote her when they were courting. In more subtle refinements, she may simply burn the potatoes. As far as General Hershey is concerned, there is a sensible way to deal with this matter. Let Selective Service assemble a large group of discontented young men, call in the press and television to assure national publicity, give each man a draft card and a box of matches, and tell him to burn away. What these men will discover is that a draft card is one of the most unsatisfying things in the world to burn. It creates a contemptibly small flame and goes out in less than 60 seconds. We're now ready for questions.
General Hershey, my name is David Mortensen. I'm a second-year law student. I have a question which I think is directed to the administration of the Selective Service system and will be of particular interest to law students. You mentioned in your speech that undergraduate students are theoretically subject to an ascending scale of standards that if you ever wanted to invoke would be apply. In each successive year they would have to have a higher rank in their class in order to maintain their 2S deferment. Earlier this fall I wrote to my local draft board and asked them if this was true of graduate students, and in particular if this was true of law students. And the reply I got back, citing pamphlets 46 and 47 of the Selective Service System Bulletin, said that this did not apply to graduate students so long as they were in the active process of seeking their degree, but as for law students who were seeking a bachelor's degree, they would be treated like undergraduate students. I wonder if you would comment on the equity of this.
Well, in the first place, I'm not so sure I understand what we were charged with in the undergraduate, not extraordinary. In other words, there was a time that we required a person to have a lower standard as he progressed towards graduation. But we haven't been using this position in class for quite a number of years. We've been probably listening to them, and if they are in school and were tolerated by a generous faculty or administration, we said, well done. But I have said that we weren't going to do that now. Now, the law student raises a peculiar question, and one which it's a good buck passing to have to say that
You, of course, are lawyers, and therefore you've read that part of the Act which said that no local board shall be compelled to defer any student because of any test, any place in class, or anything else from a contractor or from the United States or from any other place. Now, that doesn't mean he doesn't get deferred, but it does say that it leaves it directly in the hands of the local board. And I don't believe that there's any use of talking about a national policy. And I don't believe I'm going to get into the question of whether law students are graduate students or whether they're not. I think that issue's around there, and you might find some difference of opinion between the states. Where I'll get into it is when you've exhausted your appeals elsewhere, and when you have gone to the appeal board and you couldn't get at least one man to agree with you, and you go to the state director and he'll have none of you to make your appeal, that's when you'll be to me to make an appeal to the presidential or the National Selective Service Appeal Board for you. And when that board is acted, and I think that they will act on it as an individual case, you're not going to get a rule of the thumb that any clerk can interpret in our system, I don't believe. And I know that's a very unsatisfactory answer, but it isn't near as unsatisfactory if I tell you it was going to take all of you.
My name is Lillian Seiniger of Boston. If I understood you, General, you said that when we elect people, we have to take their policies. No matter what they are, if they foist it on us, we have to accept it. Don't you think that that President Johnson sneaked this war on the public while...
I'm sorry, what was this last?
Don't you feel that if you think it over, don't you feel... Don't you feel that in this particular case, in this presidential election, that Johnson sneaked this war on the public, please let me finish, while he was sneering at Goldwater?
Well, one of the things, I come from Indiana where politicians never come from. And I don't know all of the idiosyncrasies of the campaign. It hasn't been my responsibility, and it may sound very simple. But I don't have the luxury of making up my mind about campaigns. I think they're necessary, and I may not like the way they run or the way they get out. But after they're over, I'm so thankful that they're over that I abide by the results of them.
On that note, I think we conclude. I'd like to thank the panel and to thank the audience.
You've been listening to recorded highlights of the topic, The Future of the American Draft. Our guest speaker was Lieutenant General Louis B. Hershey, Director of the Selective Service System. The panelists were Donald J. Irwin, Democratic Congressman from the state of Connecticut, and John Maher, Regional Director of Research, Students for a Democratic Society. The moderator was Professor Philip E. Arita of the Harvard Law School. The Harvard Law School Forum is a presentation of WHDH Public Affairs.